Good evening. This is the second video of my series. I'm very happy to be doing this, and I have with me as my guest Mark Fletcher, who's a climate activist and a member of Extinction Rebellion. And I'm very pleased that he's agreed to join me for a conversation. It's especially good for me because I have tried to engage with some discussion with the Extinction Rebellion before on their webpage, and didn't really get very far, and found that they were unwilling to really answer the questions I was asking, and I was taking a genuine interest. So it's really good for me to have this conversation today, and very appreciative of Mark for joining us. So Mark, thank you. And would you like to tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be involved in Extinction Rebellion and your projects at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks first of all for sort of having me on your channel, and it's great to to meet you and be able to sort of chat some of this stuff through. So yeah, by way of introduction, I'm 46 years old. I'm married. I've got 4 kids, sort of ranging from well, nearly 17 down to 8. And I live in Norwich. I run a small business, which is a recruitment business. And yeah, I'm a Christian, and faith is an important part of my life. So that's the sort of headline stuff, I guess. And then I guess in terms of sort of climate activism and Extinction Rebellion, I'm a latecomer to the party, really, in terms of, I think, the science on climate change has really been fairly well established since about 1990. I can remember watching sort of a Channel 4 documentary about is the Earth heating up, and it was coming from a fairly sort of skeptical point of view. I think it was sort of arguing at the time that much of the recording of data was done in cities, and that they were naturally hotter because of energy use and so on. So that was a sort of climate skeptic sort of program, I suppose, in the late 80s. I remember watching as a teenager. So I guess the climate issue has been there in the background, put it that way, but it's not really been something I was really aware of in a great deal of detail, probably until about 2018. And I think over the course of that year, a couple of things sort of happened that kind of really put it front and center of my sort of consciousness. And the first one was a David Attenborough program, that I can't remember what the title was now, but it was something. Essentially, it was a documentary about the climate crisis, and it was David Attenborough kind of really talking about just how many species have gone extinct and are going extinct. And I was really hit by it. I think the sort of just the sense of these magnificent creatures, all sorts of creatures, insect life, animals, sea creatures that have been on this planet for however many years, just being wiped out, very, very quickly in a very short period of time. And that sort of really shocked me, and it kind of got me interested, I guess, or sort of feeling like this is something I need to pay attention to. And then I think one of the IPCC reports came out, and I looked at it, I sort of read it, and I kind of started to see, some of these interconnected issues, I guess, about the planet heating up, about there being widespread consensus, something like 2,000 scientists feeling that it was anthropogenic, heating, feeling like we were on a trajectory sort of 2 degrees of warming or more. And I think where it hit me was for my kids. I sort of thought, my youngest is 8 years old. I was thinking, a lot of these things we're talking about 2050 and where we're going to be by 2050. And I thought, well, he's going to be pushing 30. And I thought, what sort of world is he going to be dealing with at that point? And so that was a real game changer for me. I looked at some of the reports. I think there was a UN report that said that, something like 2 billion people live in areas where, they're at risk of flooding, coastal cities, or they are in areas like sub-Saharan Africa that would become unlivable in really at sort of 2 degrees of warming. And so I started to kind of visualize, you know, what would a world look like with something like 2 billion people on the move. And it wasn't hard, actually, because I think at the time, you know, the Syrian conflict was quite, you know, quite developed and advanced at that stage. And I think that's the biggest refugee crisis we've seen really so far. And that was something like 5 million people displaced and about 500,000 people killed. And I started to sort of roll up those numbers and think, well, you know, 2 billion people, what if, say, 1 billion of those are on the move, trying to migrate to more habitable places? What if through conflict over resources like water and food, you know, 100 million people are killed in conflict? And it was just, you know, off the chart, really. It was kind of like I started to think, yeah, wars in Southern Europe could be, you know, became very imaginable, you know, food shortages, you know, serious disruption to our way of life, if not indeed, you know, really significant collapse of society. And so, yeah, this kind of desire to do something started to kind of awaken in me, I guess. And Extinction Rebellion, I think, had sort of had a sort of rebellion in London, I think in the April, that was quite colourful and sort of quite, you know, grabbed the news headlines. And so I thought, I need to find out more and I need to go along. And I think one of the sort of first things I engaged with was a video on YouTube by a guy called Roger Hallam, which was called Heading for Extinction. And that was quite a shocking and sort of motivational sort of video, where he sort of outlined this sort of stark kind of future and this sort of theory of change that involved, you know, civil disobedience and arrest, as mass arrest, as a sort of strategy. And it would really, you know, nothing like this had been on my radar before. You know, I'd not been involved with sort of protest groups or activism really, or, you know, anything like that before. But, you know, over the course of watching that and starting to sort of then talk to other people who were involved with Extinction Rebellion, I started to get a sense of conviction about it. And so, yeah, I started to get involved myself. And that was really from probably about October 2019 onwards, you know, that I was, you know, have been fairly actively involved, both at sort of, you know, regional and national level.
So, yeah, thank you for summarizing. That's really interesting. So from your perspective at the moment, what do you feel that the governments plural around the world what could they be doing more of that they're not doing? You see, from my perspective, I remember a time when the environmental campaign was largely a peripheral campaign, and it fed into a sort of subset narrative and a political fringe movement that wasn't likely to get into the mainstream very quickly. And over time, I think what's been interesting has been that the talk of climate crisis and the talk about needing to get to net zero by different years are propounded, but let's say 2050 was the first one that I heard, and now they're talking about possibly even 2030. So I suppose if you want to say that you've made a big difference to the government's narrative and the way the government is now approaching the climate crisis, it's clear that you've definitely shaken things substantially. What do you think that the government is not doing enough of, given that they're having summits, given that they're making what I think are quite radical promises about reactions to carbon and the discontinuation of it? What do you want them to do more of that they're not doing, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, Well, there are a number of things I think. So I think firstly, I don't think of the climate crisis as a kind of environmental challenge. You know, I think about it as an existential threat to humanity. So, for example, there was a report by Chatham House sort of think tank that came out recently that sort of said, look, you know, based on where, you know, all the pledges governments have made, you know, they think there's a 95% chance that global temperatures will be above 2 degrees by 2040. And, you know, then you look at sort of, say, the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence published a sort of defence and security report about what sort of plans they're making and how they feel they need to adapt by 2050. And they are, you know, obviously planning for contingencies, but their contingency is they expect 3.5 degrees of warming by 2050. So even the MOD doesn't believe that the government is likely to achieve the objective of 1.5 degrees, which is the sort of Paris Agreement target. So what I'm saying, I suppose, is that I think climate change is a threat to everything that we care about. You know, it's a threat to democracy. It's a threat to sort of liberal society. It's a threat to progressive society in which, you know, people, human life can flourish. Because I think, you know, the numbers of people that are at risk of dying, you know, through heat, you know, extreme heat stroke, through, you know, multiple breadbasket failures, you know, wheat harvests collapsing across Europe, and there not being enough food, you know, literally to sustain populations, is very, very credible, you know. And so for me, this is an existential crisis. And what I would like governments to do is to mobilize in a sort of Herculean sort of Marshall Plan, post-World War II style way, where they sort of say, look, whatever it takes, we've got to get a grip of this. And if that means the transformation of society in a very short period of time, which is what the scientists are saying. I mean, Sir David King, who was the former chief scientific advisor to the Blair and Brown governments, you know, has said very clearly, you know, what we do in the next 3 or 4 years will determine the future of humanity. And so I think what we need is this sort of radical mobilization of governments to totally transform society, you know, in every way, you know, from food production to housing to transport. You know, take the UK as a country, you know, we're extremely vulnerable. And I think we've seen that vulnerability actually over the last 2 years with Brexit. So we import 50% of our food. If you look at fresh produce, it goes up to about 75%. If you look at energy, we import about 50% of our domestic energy consumption. You know, we're extremely vulnerable to disruption in global supply chains. And, you know, so I think whether you're politically sort of on the right, which tends to sort of favor, you know, nation state identity and kind of, you know, security of the realm, or whether you're on the left and you're looking for a sort of fair and more progressive society, I think you need to be paying attention to climate change, because it actually threatens both of those things. You know, it threatens liberal democracies, because actually there's a crisis of democracy that climate change is kind of provoking, which is really that a lot of young people particularly don't believe democracy in the form that we have it is kind of equipped to deal with you know, with this crisis, you know, that it's actually incapable of making the decisions that are needed. And so then what you get is almost this opportunity for sort of people like Putin or China to kind of step forward and say, look, you know, it's only the great, you know, the big sort of dictatorships of the world that can make the decisions to move at scale. So I say I'm sort of rambling a bit in lots of directions, but I think, you know, what I want is the government to take the issue seriously and to develop a plan that has real tangible actions on it to move really rapidly. And I think we've seen that they can do that. You know, I mean, I think COVID in a sense is a really interesting and useful dress rehearsal for the climate crisis, because I think when you present British people, you know, with the facts, they demonstrate that they're quite rational, actually. You know, that if you say to people, look, this is a public health emergency, this is what it means, by and large, most people will say, okay, I accept that life is going to have to change, whether that's wearing a mask or going into lockdown or whatever it is. And they, by and large, accept that as long as they feel everybody else is playing along and they feel that the politicians are in it with them, and it's not one rule for the elites and one rule for everybody else. So I think, you know, if the government said to people, look, you know, we're heading for a world that's 2.5 degrees hotter, and it's not clear that organized human society can function in a world that hot. We've got to make some drastic changes now, and this is what it's going to look like. I think as long as there was support for people to make those transitions, most people would be up for doing that. And I do worry that the messaging around the climate issue coming out of COP is essentially, we've got it in hand. You don't need to worry. It's sort of bad, but it's not going to be bad for a while, and there's still time to sort of fix it. Whereas actually, I think most of the scientists you talk to feel it's a lot worse than we thought. It's happening quicker. It's happening at bigger scale than we thought. And the need to sort of really act transformatively is kind of right here, right now. So yes, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So recently we've had the group Insulate Britain have been sitting on the motorways and causing lots of disruption, and in some cases health issues too. And I know that some members of Extinction Rebellion have disavowed that. They're saying they're taking it too far. So are you in favor of what Insulate Britain are doing, or do you think that they are taking it a step too far because it's having too much disruption on ordinary people's lives?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, it's been a really interesting campaign, hasn't it? Because it's it's definitely kind of caught the popular imagination, and it's been quite controversial. I think the fundamental sort of messaging and the sort of logic behind the campaign is really strong. You know, you look, we've shifted to renewables quite significantly. So we've cut carbon emissions by increasing our share of energy generation from renewables. Where do you go next in the UK to try and cut carbon emissions quickly? You've really only got two options. You know, one is housing, one is food production, and possibly you could say aviation. But, you know, housing accounts for about sort of 16% of our carbon emissions. And what Insulate Britain are saying, I think rightly, is that, look, you know, the government's own Committee on Climate Change has identified insulating homes as a priority for decarbonising the economy. And the amount of money the government's allocated to it has been utterly minimal. You know, I mean, it sounds like a big number. I think it was something like £1.3 billion. But there's 29 million homes in Britain, so that's probably about £3 a house. You know, so it's, you know, enough to sort of buy a newspaper and sort of roll it up and stuff it under the front door. It's not a serious policy to insulate Britain's homes. And so I think Insulate Britain are right to say this is a quick win. You know, insulating our homes gives the biggest bang for buck in terms of investment. It will create hundreds of thousands of green jobs. It will help with levelling up the north. And I think they're also right to say that it's absolutely immoral that, you know, 8,500 people die every winter because of the cold. You know, we're the 6th richest country in the world, and it is scandalous. You know, I think that there are still so many people living in fuel poverty. Something like 7 million people, I think, in the UK live in fuel poverty and have to choose between, you know, heating their homes and eating. And that can't be right. So I think the moral logic of the campaign is right. I think the economic logic of the campaign is right. The controversial bit, of course, is the sitting in the road, blocking the M25. And I fully understand the sort of shock and concern people feel about that. I guess all I would say, you know, in response to that is that I think the people that are involved in the campaign are very principled people, and I think what they're feeling is if we don't reduce our carbon emissions, you know, we're going to be we're going to be experiencing a lot more disruption than sort of 30-minute delays on the M25. You know, we're going to be seeing parts of London flooded. We're going to be seeing food shortages, rationing, lack of, you know, all sorts of social issues. And we've seen, you know, just this year really, how quickly, you know, when those fuel shortages were happening, it got to the stage where there were fights on forecourts and things like that. And so I suppose, yes, it's Insulate Britain are disruptive. Yes, it's extremely inconvenient. It's extremely annoying, but it does get the topic onto all of the news channels. It does get massive attention. And, you know, if we don't sort this climate issue out, you know, we are all going to be experiencing very, very substantial, well, more than disruption, really, you know, I mean, really serious consequences in our lives, you know, and certainly, you know, if not in our lives immediately, you know, certainly really dire consequences for anybody that's living nearer to the equator than us, or, you know, in a coastal region to us. So I guess that's my sort of take on it. Yeah.
I think I've got a few thoughts on this. One thing that comes to mind is, outside of how the behavior is observed, I think I'm reminded of an observation by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. He talks about the fact that we don't subject women to witch hunts anymore in this country. And he says the reason we don't do it isn't because of a moral improvement, it's because we don't believe that there are witches anymore. In other words, the thing that significantly changed for us in our eradication of witch hunts isn't that we would think it immoral to do so if we did believe there are witches. In fact, there are several states in America that still put people to death for arguably lesser crimes. If we did believe that somebody was a witch who could, you know, bring about awful consequences through supernatural divination, then they are the sort of people that we would probably put to death if we put anybody to death. I don't personally believe in that the death penalty is right, but he made a good point, I think, about matters of fact, and that the actual distinction really is that how we've changed our opinion about them, not necessarily our morals. And I think the climate issue for me is largely about interpretation of facts. And because I had to, you know, look at some of the activities of Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, who I know they've compared themselves recently to the suffragettes and to Martin Luther King. And if they're right about the facts, then actually we could say, yeah, these people are ahead of the game, and more of us should actually be going out. I don't agree with the civil unrest, and I don't think disrupting ordinary people's lives and they're stopping them earning a living, stopping ambulances getting through. I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think it shows a bit of a lack of imagination. But I do think that if they are right about the facts, then like the suffragettes and like the civil rights movement and groups of that kind, they probably could make some claim to being quite prescient on this. I think where I would put a counter argument is that when I look at how society has evolved in the last couple of hundred years, I see something quite different. And I think this is perhaps the biggest challenge to the environmentalists. I would say that for most of our human existence, despite whatever achievements we've made politically, religiously, whatever, scientifically, we have, for the large part, lived in abject poverty. The vast majority of people have lived in abject poverty. And through capitalism and through science, particularly in the last 150 years, the Industrial Revolution and the things that have developed since then, we have helped each other through cooperation, through competition, through trade, in ways that benefit the consumer and the producer, and we have risen to our feet as people, as a population, and seen the greatest enrichment that the world could have imagined 150 years ago. We just couldn't expect our ancestors to even imagine the riches that we have and the technological advancements. Now, obviously, in terms of climate environmentalism, that has come with a cost. And I think the question of how serious the climate crisis is, from my standpoint, is the key question. We have a problem. There are a lot of people that actually deny we have a problem. And I think for you and I to have the best conversation, and for people to engage generally in the problems that need to be solved, we do have to say that we are contributing to the climate change of this planet. And there are going to be problems to solve. However, the next question is, how good are we going to be at solving them? At what cost? Do we know how to predict the future that far ahead? Now, we talk about increases in temperature. We're not coming at this from a static perspective, whereby if the first projection that I read about a few years ago was that the Earth would increase by 2 degrees in the next 100 years. And it sounds like some of the scientists are now saying that might have been an underestimation, that actually we could be talking about a more serious increase. So the question then becomes, well, how do we solve a problem like that? And how serious is the problem? And I don't think we actually know how serious the problem is. I think we have shown in the last few decades, particularly with a sort of an exponential curve of scientific and technological advancement, that we are never solving problems from the perspective of now to then, without factoring in the fact that things are going to change rapidly for our ability to solve problems. There'll be things that we will produce in the next few decades that will solve a lot of these problems far more than we can possibly anticipate. Just as if we went back to the 1950s or 60s and tried to work out what the modern day society would be like, there would be lots of things we just wouldn't be able to foresee as being solutions, because we didn't even know we could solve them. So I think the question then becomes, we need a proper cost benefit analysis for working out how much we should invest in trying to solve the climate change. And I use the word invest loosely, because a lot of the things that we call investments are actually just, in terms of economics, they're costs. They are the costs of doing something. So I think there are broad questions to be asked about what makes us assume that the kind of reaction that we're seeing from the environmental side of things, in terms of government redistribution of money, and to your more extreme solutions of taking to the streets, if we don't pay homage to the fact that capitalism has given us riches that we couldn't possibly have imagined, and if we only see capitalism and the emission of fossil fuels as a sort of bogey that we need to eradicate, then we're only, I think, seeing one side of the argument. And I think that's where the climate alarmism side is probably not paying enough regard. You mentioned the David Attenborough documentary. I don't remember its title either, but I do remember watching it. And the one thing that struck me about it is how unbalanced the narrative was. They were showing isolated clips of some of the things that were happening in the world that are pretty difficult and grim in those areas, and why wouldn't we include those as part of the narrative? But we don't ever see politicians and activists say, well, what an amazing achievement that the human species has reduced poverty globally by 70–80% already in just a few decades. And most of the world was in poverty by the end of the 19th century, and by 20 years ago it was down to about 10%. Far too many, of course, still, but that doesn't come from nowhere. And I think we have to be very careful about artificially inflating the cost of energy for people that need it most. It's all very well for us to say, well, we've had our industrial revolution, we've had our technological revolution. We are now so rich and so prosperous that we can afford to say, how much carbon are we burning and what can we do to maybe reduce that? But my issue at the moment, particularly with some of the activism, is that it's rather myopic, I think, in that the proportion of the world that's still in poverty and still in crisis and is still undergoing their own industrial revolution, they don't have the luxury of saying how much carbon are we burning, because they are just trying to develop their economies to the level that we have maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it's very dangerous, I think, for them to artificially inflate the cost of carbon. And the other thing I would just add on that point is it's rather optimistic, I think, to suggest that we can just eradicate carbon altogether with a very arbitrary time frame. I mean, even if we agree in principle that it might be good to eradicate carbon, or at least get down to a much lower usage of it, which seems to me a reasonable goal if we can improve the technology and rely on renewables and particularly solar energy, I would say, as a very good future source of energy. And that's not going to go away, is it? So that's a great thing we could be doing when we harness the technology for that. But I think it's a narrative that doesn't show both sides, and I think it never has, as far as I can see, it has never offered a cost-benefit analysis of why this is the right response to future climate change. It's never ever said, well, these are the benefits of burning fossil fuels. Look at the great enrichment we've experienced. Look at how the future technology will give us solutions that we didn't even know were possible, and show prospective problems that they weren't very problematic at all, as we've seen loads of times in the past, and say that it's a cost-benefit analysis that needs justifying. The fact that we've never seen that leads me to act suspiciously towards it, because I think if you do want to solve problems and look at solutions, you always see that the people who are seeking the truth to those solutions and problems are looking at both sides and having a really reasoned debate. And I worry that the climate change environmentalists don't have that side of the argument. So they don't really know whether, and the government will only listen to the sort of the national pulse of the electorate. The government just reflects what the electorate wants it to do, largely, as does the media, and that may happen in bursts, or it may happen gradually. But the fact that the politicians are speaking in this language is because they're used to the electorate, the people that on whom they depend for their jobs, are also speaking that language too. So that's my concern, is the lack of reasoned debate and a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. And because that's missing, I worry that there's an agenda, and we can come to what that might be soon. But that's what I'd like to
yeah. What do you? I mean, I think you make some really interesting observations, and that there's a lot in what you've just said. Gosh, it's hard to know where to begin, really. I think so. I mean, I think firstly, for me, one of the things I think it is important to do is to sort of look at, yes, as you say, on the one hand, what have been the benefits of capitalism, what has been achieved through industrialization. But I think it's also fair to critique capitalism and to sort of ask, well, have there been some unintended consequences? Where are we to take on it? This is a sort of personal take. Is I think capitalism's been fantastically effective at generating wealth. I don't think you can argue with that. It generates money very effectively. But my observation is that it concentrates that wealth in an ever diminishing number of people, rather than distributing that wealth equitably. So I think there's been a sense on my journey where I've started to sort of feel, have things gone too far? Can it be right that we live in a world where 1% of the richest 1% contribute 50% of the carbon emissions on the planet, whilst the poorest 90% contribute virtually nothing really to carbon emissions, mainly, as you say, because their economies haven't developed yet in that way. But so I think there's a question for me about about the concentration of wealth in a very, very small minority of people, and therefore the extreme poverty that many millions, if not billions, of people still live in. Then I think there's a question in my mind around to what extent does capitalism really exist as a free market, and to what extent is capitalism capable of regulating itself? And so I sort of look at particularly sort of the developments we've seen in the last 20 years in the sort of technology space around platforms like Facebook or Amazon, where an enormous monopolies have been created. They're really the only way to describe those companies is they are enormous monopolies. And I wonder how healthy that is, for a cohesive society, for a democratic society. So I suppose, I think you're right to say there is an element within the climate movement of critiquing Western capitalism. And I think there is a concern around justice as well, which is to say that actually, however we solve the climate crisis, it has to be done in such a way that the poorest people don't suffer the most. That those who have the wealth and the resources to be able to manage the crisis and to mitigate and to develop the technology and to redistribute resources should do so. And I suppose I feel that from a faith point of view as well, that it concerns me that the world's poorest people are suffering now, and I would like to see Western countries do more really to help those people in the world that are really suffering this firsthand. So I think that those sort of things are definitely on my mind when I think about this issue. And I suppose I also I suppose coming back to your question about cost benefit analysis, which I think is really interesting, because I think what I hear when you say that is that for you and for perhaps many people, the climate crisis is primarily a question of sort of economics, and can we make it work economically? And I suppose what that links to then is, well, how serious a crisis do you think it is? Because if your house is on fire and your children are upstairs, you don't think twice about smashing the front door down and bursting in to sort of rescue them. At that point, you're not thinking, I wonder how much it will cost me to sort of buy a new front door. You're just thinking, the house is on fire, I've got to get the kids out. But if a fire safety consultant came to you and said, look, over the next 20 years, you really ought to think about upgrading your front door. There are real benefits to a safer, sort of more fire safe front door, and it's going to cost you 200 quid or something. You would do that cost benefit analysis. And I think some of the sort of differences in perspective are kind of coming from how immediate and how serious a crisis do you think this is. If you think it's very, very serious and sort of, it could be the end of civilization, you're probably more inclined to say, it doesn't matter what the cost is, we just have to deal with it. If you think this is something that's happening relatively slowly over the next sort of 50 to 100 years, it's much easier to sort of be able to think about it in that sort of way. And I guess that's where we probably need, some help from the scientists. And I suppose that's probably an area where I think Extinction Rebellion is a bit misunderstood, actually, because actually Extinction Rebellion is not really prescribing any sort of solution. I mean, the movement has really got three demands. The first one is to tell the truth. So that really was calling on the government and the media to sort of give the public honest and accurate information about climate change and what climate breakdown really means. The second demand was to act now. In other words, and that was linked to a kind of a call to go for net zero by 2025, which obviously is very imminent, very quick. But the third demand, and that's the one I think that's really important here, is this demand about citizens' assemblies, because I think Extinction Rebellion's never wanted to prescribe how we might solve this problem. What we've always said is that we think ordinary citizens, selected at random in much the same way you might comprise a jury, although on a bigger scale, maybe 100 citizens chosen across a sort of wide demographic of age, sex, gender, race, wealth, where you facilitate decision making. So they're given information, they're briefed, but the aim of it is to make good decisions together. I think that's what we've always wanted, and obviously there have been sort of experiments in citizens' assemblies, both by the government, although the results weren't legally binding. They did sort of set up a citizens' assembly, and there've certainly been similar things in other countries. But I think it's really important that Extinction Rebellion don't tell everybody what they ought to do to solve this crisis. The way I think about it is we're sort of sounding the alarm on it. We're saying it's urgent and action is needed now. But what we're saying is that this is something everybody needs to have a voice in and have a stake in, because it affects all of us. And I think, we would make collectively better decisions if something like that sort of process were adopted.
One thing that was apparent to me when spending some time with at a festival with some environmentalists in about 5 or 6 years ago was I was looking at the motivations for being part of that group and trying to see if I could identify some kind of personality commonalities that what are they actually trying to, despite what they were saying, what do they actually want? What are they getting out of this? And I really sensed that the primary thing that they were getting out of it is a sense of belonging and a sense of community. And one of the guys I remember said to me, I don't really care if I'm right about this stuff. I just enjoy being part of this group. And it was a very nice environment. It was in the Catholic Workers' Farm, and they have a very admirable ethos, and I could see why it was very attractive to them. I tried to say then, and I've said many times since, that going back to the narrative of our success as a species, I think we are. This sounds difficult for people to accept, because I think they don't like to think of the mechanisms of society and progress as being bottom up or too bottom up. They don't like to think of that we can actually solve these problems collectively without the need for very much top-down management. We're control freaks at heart. We like to think we can manage our own lives, and we like to think we can manage society, and that's becoming ever more popular. But I think I think we're already doing far more to solve any potential climate issue going forward than most people really care to acknowledge or even to learn about. Because if you look at the mechanisms for a successful society and how to solve problems and how the world actually works, there are some key fundamentals, and one of which is, as I've written a paper about on my blog, called the law of parsimony, the law of least effort, that it is already in our interests as humans, whether we are employers or employees or family members, whatever it is we're doing, there's something inbuilt that strives towards making our lives better. Now, we obviously have peaks and troughs. We make a lot of mistakes. We get these things wrong. We don't always, from a local perspective, see the consequences, which you touched on earlier, the pollution, the spillover effects. But we do operate fundamentally, but through the mechanism of not wanting to have any unnecessary waste, and we operate where we want to use the fewest resources possible for the most amount of gain. Otherwise, we wouldn't be very efficient in business. And I'm not too worried about the power law inequalities that you mentioned in terms of wealth, because I think as long as they are natural monopolies, like we mentioned, I think you mentioned Facebook and Google and a couple of big corporations, Amazon. Not only are they providing a lot of value to society, but they're also, if you like, a democratic monopoly, in that nobody made them that way artificially. We created the monopoly by voting with our wallets and our purses, and we decided that we like Amazon and we like Facebook and we like the supermarkets over the high street in many cases. And so we've created a power law inequality with wealth. And when wealth is distributed in the hands of a few, it then means that more investment can be made in developing countries. In other words, if you have someone with $200 million, that person is much more likely to invest and do a lot more good than if you had 200 people with 1 million or 400 people with 500,000. So we still haven't really got to the nub of the issue, I think, which is that we're already doing as much as, or almost as much as we can. Of course, there are ways that the government could maybe help. I mean, one obvious thing is that they could, reduce taxes in accordance with companies that innovate and don't produce so many fossil fuel emissions and things like that. But I see this as an arms race, and I think a good analogy is like there's an illustration about a bear is chasing a pack of people, and one of the group says, "I hope we can all outrun the bear," and another member of the group jokingly says, "Well, we don't have to outrun the bear, we only have to outrun the slowest member of the group." And I think that's what we're dealing with the climate crisis, or certainly the climate problems that may well be ahead. I mean, and there's also, we haven't even mentioned the fact that a global warming also has many positive effects too. There are lots of cold related deaths. There are lots of areas of the world that are uninhabitable, or certainly not very likely to thrive because of the cold weather. So there are always two sides to that story as well. And I think there will be problems with global warming, and I think we do have to hope that humanity comes together to solve them. But I think we are probably doing more than you might acknowledge in solving them just by being good at using a sort of Smithian invisible hand, trying to develop our industry, trying to develop the investment in the developing world.
I guess I've sort of lost. I guess I don't see it that way, unfortunately. I guess you know, some of those kind of scandals that we've seen where, you know, we thought businesses could be trusted to sort of regulate themselves and make good decisions that were in the interests of all of us, you know, often turn out not to be the case, because the sort of profit motive is so strong, and there's sort of this sort of groupthink that takes over. So I'm thinking of things like the emissions scandals with sort of VW and some of the car manufacturers, or I mean, even recently, you know, with the water companies, where they're essentially dumping raw sewage into the seas around the UK, because it's actually cheaper for them to take the fine from the regulator than make the investment in their infrastructure that they need to make to process the sewage. And so I suppose because of that, you know, it sits uncomfortably with me to sort of say, well, I think we will naturally solve this. I agree with you that I think human beings are magnificently sort of inventive and resourceful, and we're wonderful at solving problems and very collaborative, and there's lots of things in our sort of humanity that give me hope. But I do also think there are sort of factors that can come into kind of systems, particularly sort of, you know, business and economic systems, which mitigate against that sort of natural human compassion and inventiveness. And you know, and although the story about the bear is sort of funny at one level, in another sense it's not, because I think that is what governments are thinking. You know, they're thinking, we don't have to outrun the beast of climate change. All we've got to do is sort of throw the poor people that live in the Sahara and around the equator, you know, into the jaws of the beast, while we keep on making money from burning fossil fuels, so that we can develop the technology to sort of get beyond this. And you know, and I think that's a moral question. I mean, you know, you may be comfortable with that. We, you know, as Boris said, you know, maybe the bodies do need to pile high in the streets. You know, but that's not a position that I'm comfortable with. You know, I would rather get hold of the 5 people that are running away from the bear and say, guys, let's fight this thing together. You know, let's deal with the bear.
But I actually think that's what we're doing is another part of the analogy that you mentioned, but I think it's actually the other way around. I think in getting so rich and being so prosperous to the level that we can afford to be mindful of our emissions, in making our energy artificially expensive for the poorest people in the world, which we are doing, and that's having massive implications and will have even bigger implications still, we are effectively saying some of the group can outrun this bear, but the slowest members, we're just going to trip them up and stop them being able to run. And I don't think, unless we admit that that is happening, I don't think the climate arguments are going to add enough weight to the narrative. I think the only way to solve climate change, as far as I can see, because it's the only way that's ever worked and it's the only way we know, is to help the rest of the world become greener. Because there's no question that there's a correlation, a positive correlation between economic development and greenness. It's called the environmental Kuznets curve. Cities are naturally more environmentally friendly than rural areas because you have a concentration of people, you have a network whereby it's more efficient to travel, it's more efficient to communicate. Obviously, I don't even need to mention the fact that the revolutions of technology that have saved our ability to burn so many trees, to not rely on paper so much, I mean, even now as we're having this discussion, we're having it because technology has deemed that we don't have to get in our cars and travel to meet in a cafe and burn some diesel. So the the big issue, I think, that's not being addressed by climate alarmism is the governments. Firstly, they're not operating as collectively as we think, but also they don't actually have any idea how to solve a problem this complex. And the reason they don't have an idea is because society itself is far too complex to manage in this way. We're not going to be able to solve any future problems. And that's even assuming that we know what they are. So if you look at something like chaos theory, which is bound up in weather prediction, there's a reason why we know what the weather will be like this evening, but we don't know so accurately what it will be like in 2 weeks' time. We can start, the further away from the projection we get, the harder it is to predict. And that's exactly the same with climate problems. It's, well, we know that it looks like the global temperature is going to increase. And, we're not even talking about trivial numbers here. I mean, I think the last time I read up on the stats, just the UK alone is willing to spend, I think it was £97 million a day for the next 30 years. And that's a country that emits 1% of global emissions. Now, we are talking about astronomical figures here. And to have that much money spent on trying to mitigate a putative disaster, or certainly a change in environment, particularly given the technological advancements we'll make, then you have to be pretty confident that you're making the right decisions, because the costs of climate change response is absolutely astronomical. And I don't just mean the amount of money that's spent on the green technology, which again, going back to my first point, is it's a cost first. If it's an investment, it's an investment second. It's certainly a cost, because jobs are the cost of doing things. So we are spending a lot of money, and my biggest challenge, I think, to climate change environmentalism is that the governments don't really know how to solve this. Everything is so complexly interconnected, and we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels because everything we do is connected to fossil fuels, and there's no way we have an idea about how to change that without the mechanisms I mentioned earlier, which is through the adhering to the basic mechanisms of how society work, which is to try to become more efficient, to use fewer resources, to be smarter, and get ourselves in a position where we can zoom in from our own houses rather than having to travel. And that's just a microcosmic example of all of the things that we're doing globally. And in doing that, we are helping the poorest people in the world scramble to their feet, have their own industrial revolution. And I just think that stopping people going to work, obstructing the highways, I think it's short-sighted. I think it doesn't pay enough regard to the way we should be celebrating human achievements and how well we've done in getting this far. And of course, the other thing I would add is that the poorest countries in the world are having their own industrial revolution similar to ours a few decades ago, at a time when the rest of the world is pretty rich. And when we had our industrial revolution, and the dozen or so European countries that started the industrial revolution along with America later, there was nobody else that was rich in the world. We were the first people to become anything like what we would consider rich. And I think, and that means, as we've seen with lots of the countries that were as poor as African countries in the 60s, that are now some of the most booming economies on the planet, economic freedom has enabled them to get to that level. And there might be a political discussion about how we feel about the sort of left and right of economics, which I think is perhaps another matter. But there's no question in my mind that this is the primary driver of prosperity and problem solving. And that's the way that we're going to tackle any climate problems in the future. It's through economic freedom and global development within the countries that need it most.
Mm. It's been so interesting because we obviously are coming from sort of quite different starting points, and it's been good to kind of hear that level of confidence, I guess, that you've got in I don't know if you'd call it free market economics or what your sort of phrase would be, but to solve these problems. Um, I guess for me, I feel, you know, we've all, we're all invested in this issue ultimately, to one degree or another, because this is the only planet we have, and we share it. And I think, it's an interesting time to be alive because, there is a degree of sort of openness at one level on this sort of, in terms of sort of internationalism. There does seem to be a desire, with the change of government in the States, to sort of have a more outward looking perspective. And so that is interesting. But I think for me, I want to find ways of ordinary people being much more involved in the decision making and the sort of world that we're trying to create at the end of this. What would that, I mean, as a another way of putting it would be, it's all very well to save the world, but what sort of world are we saving it to become? And I think that's an important question to think about. What would we like human society to be like? And how can we work towards that? And yeah, I guess for me, direct action, whilst it's annoying and disruptive, it does seem to play a role in putting an issue on the national agenda and getting the government to sort of look at things. And I suppose I would argue, look, the fossil fuel companies and the banks have got, huge amounts of money, lots of resources. They can spend a lot of money on lobbying. It's very easy for them to get the ear of government. But for ordinary people that are worried about climate change and are really worried about it, really worried about their children's futures and what the world might look like, sometimes just putting your body in the road is the only thing you've got. And, it does provoke a response. And I think, that's what's happening sometimes in those protests. Is it's just people being very vulnerable, because they don't have, they don't get to have sort of private dinners with Boris or whoever it might be and put their point of view across. They have to find other ways to kind of get this issue into the national consciousness.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would want to do is give them put an arm on their shoulder and say, it's such a shame that you're so worried, because you are in the peak, and I say the peak because we only have the present to measure it by the minute, but in terms of anything that humanity's ever done, then we are in the peak of enrichment, and yet in terms of material prosperity, and yet our descendants are going to be better off than us in a way that they couldn't, or that we couldn't even imagine them being better off. I will just say one thing as well about capitalism. I certainly don't subscribe to the view that the market solves everything and that capitalism is the big panacea to cure all of our human ills. I think it's the most successful thing we've ever discovered. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the success and the fruitfulness of capitalism is that of all of the best things that predated capitalism that humans put forward, which are even Christianity itself, which is our shared faith, the Greeks and the political and philosophical revolutions that the Greeks had, the scientific revolution, the institution of a parliamentary system that has been developed in modern European countries 200 years ago, 300 years ago, have all been fantastic achievements, and none of them, despite being intrinsically profound and good, have increased the living standards of humans. So substantially, I mean, compared with trade and competition. And I think I would say that capitalism has got so many things for which we should be thankful, but it's not the be all and end all either. I think where I would share with you is that there has to be a greater social coalescence. There has to be a cooperation socially and with communities. One of my books is about economics, and I've called it, or I've certainly coined the term community libertarianism, in that we love the market for all its qualities and for all of the things that the fruits that we've enjoyed from its labor, but there's certainly a need for human collective action when it comes to solving problems and how we treat each other and how we work together to solve things that the market cannot solve. And I think I would like to have that message, for the Extinction Rebellions of this world, that actually you live in such a great enrichment that please don't worry about whether you have 1, 2, or 3 children. In fact, you're probably going to do more for solving problems by having 3 children than you will 2, because those children are going to be so rich and so developed compared to what their parents are and their grandparents. So yeah, let's end on a positive note and say that it's great if governments can try to steer the direction in favor of more efficiency, certainly not wasting resources, as you mentioned earlier, malpractices that are pollution that doesn't pay regard to the negative consequences and the negative consequences of capitalism. So yeah, I think it's a good place to end. I think it's past 5, and I think it's been really good to have a conversation with you. It's great to be able to get your views and to hear your thoughts, because I wouldn't have had much of a chance, I don't think, to hear them, certainly on the Extinction Rebellion webpage. So
well, it's been great to chat. Thank you, James. Yeah, really, really interesting. I feel like there's more we could have explored, but as you say, the time is up, and perhaps another time we can sort of revisit or delve into some things we didn't get to talk about today. But it's been really enjoyable.
Absolutely, for me too.
Thank you.
And likewise, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you.